Most people believe fighters survive in the UFC because they evolve, clean up their lives, and eventually get protected. Matt Brown's career tells a different story. He stayed not because the system saved him, but because the system found someone who could walk into violence again and again without asking for safety in return. This video is not about redemption. It's not about recovery, motivation, or second chances. It's about structure, about how a fighter forged in addiction fit perfectly into a business that doesn't need everyone to become champion material, only dependable when chaos is required. Brown didn't arrive in the UFC as a project that needed fixing. He arrived already calibrated for damage. His relationship with pain, fear, and consequence had been reshaped long before he ever stepped into the octagon. And in a sport where hesitation kills momentum, that kind of fighter becomes immediately useful. The UFC doesn't need every athlete to be preserved. It needs some of them to stabilize violence, to make sure fights don't stall, to make sure cards don't flatten, to make sure intensity never disappears from the product. Fighters like Matt Brown solved that problem without needing instructions. What kept him in the UFC wasn't protection, patience, or belief in a long-term future. It was his willingness to engage every time, regardless of risk, without expecting the system to soften around him. And once you understand why Matt Brown was kept, you begin to notice a pattern that extends far beyond one-career fighters who aren't managed for preservation, but for absorption. Fighters whose value isn't measured by belts, but by how much instability they can carry so the rest of the structure stays intact. This is where the system reveals itself. Addiction didn't give Matt Brown discipline, technique, or clarity. What it left behind was something far more consequential for a combat sport: a fundamentally altered relationship with self-preservation. Years of substance abuse didn't simply damage his body or disrupt his life. They reshaped how his nervous system responded to pain, fear, and consequence. For most people, pain is a stop signal. It tells the body to retreat, reassess, survive. For Brown, pain lost that authority long before he became a professional fighter. When pain becomes routine, it stops regulating behavior. When consequences repeat without resolution, they stop deterring action. This isn't toughness in the heroic sense. It's desensitization. And desensitization behaves very differently inside a cage. Fighters are trained to tolerate discomfort, but very few arrive already fluent in chaos. Brown did. Long before the octagon, his life had conditioned him to function while exhausted, unstable, and under constant internal pressure. Violence wasn't something he needed to access. It was already familiar territory. The cage didn't introduce danger into his life. It reorganized it. This distinction matters because aggression can be coached, but indifference to damage cannot. Technique can be refined, but a blunted fear response is either there or it isn't. When a fighter no longer instinctively pulls away from danger, exchanges lengthen, risks multiply. The tempo of violence increases without conscious effort. This isn't romantic, it's mechanical. Brown didn't fight recklessly because he wanted chaos or crowd approval. He fought that way because the internal systems that normally enforce caution had already been eroded elsewhere. The octagon became a controlled environment for something he had already survived without structure. And this is where the system quietly benefits. A fighter who doesn't need encouragement to engage reduces uncertainty. He doesn't require a specific opponent or storyline to guarantee intensity. His presence alone raises the baseline of violence in any bout. That kind of reliability is valuable in a business built on live events, audience retention, and momentum. This wasn't accidental. The UFC didn't need to create that mindset. It only needed to recognize it. Once identified, a fighter shaped by addiction becomes structurally useful, not because he is broken, but because he is already adapted to conditions others struggle to endure. What addiction left behind wasn't just damage. It left behind a fighter uniquely suited to absorb risk without hesitation. And once that quality proves reliable, it begins to define everything that comes next. This is where the structure starts locking into place. The UFC doesn't develop every fighter with the same intention, because it doesn't need every fighter for the same function. Some athletes are cultivated as long-term investments, insulated after losses, and positioned carefully toward titles. Others are managed as short-term attractions, And then there are fighters whose value is neither future promise nor brand protection, but reliability inside chaos. Matt Brown fell squarely into that last category. From an organizational perspective, Brown didn't arrive as a problem that required correction. His style didn't need refinement, and his mentality didn't need adjustment. He delivered intensity without hesitation, urgency without prompting, and engagement without dependence on circumstance. In a promotion built around live events, that combination solves more problems than it creates. This is where fans often misread opportunity as belief. Brown was booked often. He received chances, contracts, and prominent placements. But those weren't signs of protection. They were signs of functional trust. He could be placed into high-risk matchups, momentum-heavy situations, or volatile stylistic clashes and still guarantee a certain outcome, not victory, but violence. This is where the system reveals itself. Fixing a fighter implies future upside. Managing a fighter implies risk mitigation. With Brown, the calculation was simpler. His value wasn't projected forward, it was realized immediately. Every appearance delivered what the product required. That removed the incentive to redesign him into something safer or more efficient. Intervention would have introduced friction. Refinement risks hesitation. Hesitation lowers tempo. And lowered tempo threatens the one thing the UFC must protect at all costs: engagement. Brown's willingness to press forward without self-protection eliminated that risk. This wasn't neglect. It was alignment. The organization didn't fail to notice Brown's growth as a person or athlete. It simply didn't reorganize around it. Systems don't pivot for individual evolution unless that evolution alters value. Brown's development didn't make him safer, it made him more self-aware. Awareness doesn't translate into leverage inside a structure that already has what it needs. So his role stayed fixed. Not because alternatives were unavailable, but because none were necessary. The system had found a component that fits seamlessly into its machinery. And once a component fits, the system doesn't redesign itself, it keeps running. Opportunity kept coming without insulation attached because, from the structure's point of view, nothing was broken. Brown wasn't being pushed upward or held back. He was being kept exactly where his function was most reliable. And once that function is proven, it defines the terms of everything that followed. By the middle stretch of Matt Brown's UFC career, a clear pattern had formed not in headlines, but in how his fights were used. Short turnarounds, opponents with momentum, matchups designed to test durability rather than protect it. These weren't careful steps up a ladder, they were collisions. Brown became a constant variable dropped into uncertain equations. When the UFC needed to maintain tempo on a card, Brown was reliable. When a rising fighter needed a test that would prove legitimacy, Brown was credible. When stylistic chaos threatened predictability, Brown absorbed it. His fights didn't exist to advance rankings as much as they existed to stabilize energy. This is where violence stops being a byproduct and becomes currency. In the UFC's structure, not every bout is designed to move someone forward. Some bouts exist to guarantee pace. Brown's presence did exactly that. He removed the risk of flat performances. Even as his approach evolved later in his career, the expectation remained fixed. Exchanges would happen, damage would be taken, and the audience would stay engaged. This is where the system reveals itself. Because when violence becomes a reliable output, the way a fighter is valued changes. Wins matter less than delivery. Losses don't disqualify usefulness. Longevity becomes secondary to consistency. A fighter like Brown doesn't need a belt to justify his place. His role is justified every time the intensity stays high. This isn't unique to him. Combat sports depend on these pressure points. Fighters who absorb uncertainty, so the broader structure remains predictable. Brown absorbed that uncertainty repeatedly. He took on volatility others were insulated from. This wasn't accidental. Once a fighter proves he can function as violence on demand, the system begins to orbit around that reliability. Bookings come not because the fighter is being moved towards something, but because the card needs anchoring. The value isn't future promise. It's immediate effect. And here's the critical distinction. Currency gets spent. Violence doesn't compound like titles or brand equity. It depletes. Each exchange carries a cost, and that cost accumulates quietly: reaction time, recovery, durability, margin. For fighters whose value is tied to how much they can absorb, the system doesn't need to push them upward. It only needs to keep them available until the exchange rate worsens. That's the trade-off embedded in Brown's career. He wasn't elevated because elevation would have required preservation. He was deployed carefully, but deployed nonetheless. And once violence is treated as currency, the next phase becomes unavoidable, because eventually, the cost starts to surface. For a long time, the structure held because damage stayed abstract. It reset after every fight. Pain belonged to the cage, not to life outside it. As long as that separation existed, the system functioned smoothly, and Matt Brown functioned inside it. But separation erodes. What changes first isn't performance, it's margin. Recovery takes longer. Small injuries stop disappearing. Reaction time dulls just enough to matter. For fighters whose value is built on aggression, those changes don't immediately reduce usefulness. They increase risk. The same willingness to engage now carries heavier consequences. This is where time becomes the invisible variable. Damage doesn't accumulate in straight lines. It compounds quietly. Each exchange slightly alters how much a fighter can absorb before something gives. But the structure doesn't register that shift until output changes. As long as the fights remain violent, the system reads success. This is the quiet trap. Because when violence remains visible, cost stays invisible. Brown could still deliver intensity, so expectations stayed fixed. The UFC doesn't recalibrate roles based on what it takes to maintain output, only on whether output still exists. There is no built-in mechanism for softening demand, only continuation. And continuation has momentum. This is where normalization sets in. Repeated exposure makes damage feel routine. What once would have triggered concern becomes background noise. Fighters built around absorption internalize that normalization faster than anyone else. They don't interpret it as exploitation. They interpret it as responsibility, as identity, as proof that they still belong. Walking away doesn't feel like preservation. It feels like abandonment of function. This wasn't accidental. The system didn't need to accelerate decline. It only needed to stay consistent. Time does the rest. When a fighter's value is tied to tolerance, the end rarely arrives as a single moment. It arrives when the margin disappears, when recovery no longer catches up to demand. By then, the structure has already moved forward. Not out of malice, out of inertia. Cards still need tempo. Matchups still need certainty. Violence still needs carriers. Brown's role didn't collapse. It simply reached its limit. And once a system reaches the edge of a component's tolerance, it doesn't pause to ask what it took to get there. It transitions, quietly, cleanly, without ceremony, because the system was never designed to stop itself. By the end of his run, Matt Brown's career didn't need defending or reframing. It needed to be understood for what it actually represented inside the structure he operated within. He didn't fall short of greatness. He wasn't mishandled. And he wasn't forgotten. He occupied a role the system relies on, but rarely names fighters whose value is measured not by ceilings, but by how much instability they can absorb before something breaks. This is where many discussions drift into morality. But morality isn't required to understand mechanics. The UFC didn't promise protection to every fighter. It promised opportunity. And for fighters like Brown, opportunity meant repeated access to the cage under conditions that never fundamentally changed. The structure didn't adapt around him because it didn't need to. His function remained intact as long as he could still deliver intensity. That's the distinction most fans miss. Some fighters are managed because their future matters to the organization. Others are trusted because their presence stabilizes the present. Brown belonged to the second category. He wasn't insulated from attrition because attrition was already embedded into his role. This is where the system reveals itself. Once you recognize that difference, entire divisions look different. You start noticing which fighters are buffered after losses and which ones are immediately reinserted, which careers are slowed to preserve value, and which are accelerated until the cost becomes unavoidable. Brown's longevity didn't come from preservation. It came from acceptance. Acceptance of risk, acceptance of damage, acceptance of a role that didn't lead upward, but kept the machinery running underneath the surface. And when the damage finally outweighed the return, the system didn't fracture. It didn't need to. It transitioned forward, the way systems always do, quietly, without commentary, without revisiting the cost already absorbed. Matt Brown didn't need to be saved for the system to work. He only needed to keep showing up. That doesn't make his career tragic, and it doesn't make it heroic. It makes it revealing, because his path exposes a layer of combat sports. Most fans never look at the fighters who hold the structure together without ever standing on top of it. The UFC didn't invent that dynamic. It depends on it. And the question isn't whether Matt Brown was treated fairly. The question is, how many fighters are still being kept for the same reason, absorbing the cost so the rest of the system stays stable? Because the structure that kept him didn't disappear when he left. It's still there.